Dubro Suspicion Files.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are wrestling with a historical tragedy that, in many ways, feels as unresolved now as it was then, the assassination of John Lennon on December 8, 1980.
It really does.
And this event isn't just, a moment of historical sadness. It's more like a historical hinge.
That's a great way to put it.
It just splits into two completely different versions of reality. And which reality you see really depends on which pieces of evidence you decide to focus on.
Right.
Because the official narrative, it seems so closed, so complete. But then you start looking at the cracks, the logistical anomalies, the financial questions, and they're just too big to ignore.
And that tension is exactly what we have to navigate in this deep dive. We really have to define these two realities right at the top.
Okay, I'll do it.
So the first one, the one that's been legally established, the one that went through the courts, is what we can call the fan theory.
The official story.
The official story. This theory views Mark David Chapman as a lone, pathologically disturbed individual. His motivation was destructive. It was narcissistic. He wanted fame. He had a psychotic delusion.
So his crime is basically seen as this tragic endpoint of the chaotic, sometimes fatal relationship between celebrity and severe mental illness.
Exactly. It's a tragedy of modern culture.
And the second reality, the one that keeps this story alive 4 decades later.
That is the hitman theory. And it is a persistent and, frankly, much darker narrative.
It definitely is.
This framework suggests the assassination was actually an act of political neutralization, that it was orchestrated with, at the very least, the knowledge of U.S. intelligence agencies.
If not their direct involvement.
Right. They hypothesized that Chapman was used as a seemingly disturbed, easily manipulated asset. In essence, a modern Manchurian candidate.
A tool to silence a powerful dissident voice at a really critical moment of political change in America.
Precisely.
So our goal today is to dive deep into all of it. The specific details, the official documents on Lennon himself, the really unsettling financial history of the killer, and the minute-by-minute weirdness of the crime scene itself. All the things that continue to fuel this debate.
We're going to put the official story and the counter-narrative right next to each other.
So you, the listener, can really feel the friction between them.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I think we have to start by setting the scene, the operational context of 1980.
Yes.
Because the state of the world at that moment, it matters just as much as the state of the killer's mind.
To understand why John Lennon was even potentially seen as a threat, you have to understand the intense political world he was stepping back into in 1980.
Yeah, this wasn't a peaceful time.
Not at all. It was a threshold year. It was marking a pretty violent ideological transition in American life.
When you look back, the 60s and 70s were all about that post-war idealism, the cultural revolutions.
Right. But by 1980, the sources really suggest we were moving fast towards something much harder, much more cynical. That whole concept of realpolitik.
And that means foreign policy based on practical, material factors, not on ethics or ideology. It's about power, plain and simple.
And the geopolitical anxiety was it was through the roof.
Incredibly high. The Iranian hostage crisis had been dragging on for over a year. It was on the news every single night.
And it created this widespread sense of national humiliation, frustration.
And this real urgency for strong, decisive action. And that emotional climate was just tailor-made for a massive political shift.
And that shift arrived with an earthquake. Ronald Reagan won a huge landslide victory in November 1980.
A massive victory.
And that didn't just signal a change of president. It signaled this aggressive, decisive turn toward conservatism, huge military spending, and crucially, a much more aggressive interventionist foreign policy.
Aimed squarely at confronting the Soviet Union anywhere and everywhere.
And that aggressive posture was already focusing heavily on one particular area, wasn't it?
It was. Central America. The sources confirmed that the CIA, even before Reagan officially took office in January, was already starting and expanding covert operations against leftist insurgencies in countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua.
So these were seen as proxy wars?
Absolutely. Proxy wars against communism that required public support, or at the very least, minimal domestic dissent.
Okay, so if you're the incoming administration and you are charting a course for deep military involvement overseas, the absolute last thing you want
is a globally recognized, incredibly influential anti-war voice suddenly re-emerging to mobilize millions of young listeners.
Right. In this charged conservative interventionist environment, the very idea of John Lennon becoming politically active again was, it was inherently destabilizing to the new agenda.
And you have to remember, Lennon wasn't just some retired singer.
No.
He was the symbolic political conscience of the entire anti-war movement. He'd been effectively silent for 5 years, living in seclusion in the Dakota, being a house husband, raising his son Sean.
But his reemergence with Yoko and the Double Fantasy album, that was so much more than a musical comeback.
It was a potent global cultural event.
Yeah.
It instantly resurrected his platform.
And you can see this powerful duality even in his very last public acts. On the morning of his death, he does that incredibly famous photo shoot with Annie Leibovitz for Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
And that image, the iconic one of a naked Lennon curled around a fully clothed Yoko, it's the ultimate picture of vulnerability, of peace.
And yet, the interviews he gave that same day, including his final one with Dave Sholin, they projected something completely different.
A hunger.
A hunger, exactly. A strength, a renewed artistic purpose, and a definite readiness to engage again with the public and with the political future. He was ready to get back in the game.
So really, whether you look at it through the fan lens or the hitman lens, the moment of his return was the trigger.
It's the necessary catalyst. The theories only diverge on what happened next.
Okay, so for the fan theorist...
For the fan theorist, Lennon's massive, globally amplified fame triggered Chapman's narcissistic injury. His desperate need to just siphon that glory for himself by destroying the source. It was a purely internal, cytotic reaction to celebrity.
But for the hitman theorist, Lennon's return signaled the end of his dormant volcano period.
And it triggered a very different kind of alarm. Alarm bells inside the intelligence community who feared his ability to mobilize mass dissent against the new Reagan agenda just as the gears of war were starting to grind.
It's so clear that the climate was hostile to his message. But what's fascinating, and what we need to get into, is that this hostility wasn't new.
No, not at all.
Let's move into the documented history of why the U.S. security state had already defined Lennon as a long-term institutional problem.
This is what must be stressed. The antagonism between John Lennon and the U.S. security state was not some theoretical debate over free speech.
Yeah, this was paper.
It was an established, fully documented institutional administrative project that went back a decade.
This is so crucial. It's not paranoia when you have the paperwork. Our sources show this conflict really kicks off in the early 70s, and it's specifically targeting the 1972 election.
Yes. The Nixon administration identified Lennon as a critical, specific threat to the president's re-election. And the reason why is fascinating.
It was the youth vote.
It was the youth vote. They were terrified of his ability to galvanize and mobilize the newly enfranchised 18 to 21-year-olds.
Who had just gotten the right to vote.
Exactly. Nixon understood that Lennon's celebrity and his anti-war stance could turn that massive new voting bloc against him and potentially tip the entire election.
And that fear led directly to the FBI. We know J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had Lennon under extensive surveillance.
Oh, extensive. We're talking systematic wiretaps, physical tailing by agents, and the compilation of these thick, detailed dossiers.
Linking him to who?
Linking him and Ono directly to known American radicals of the time, people like Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. The FBI was treating him like a political operative, not a musician.
And the strategy wasn't just to watch him, it was to get him out.
Removal. The most immediate and brutal strategy they used was to weaponize the bureaucracy itself. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, they wanted to deport him.
And the official reason was, it was absurd.
It was completely absurd. The pretext was a minor 1968 marijuana conviction in London.
So old, so minor.
Old, minor, and easily dismissed by any normal standard. The fact that they were using this to try and deport a global celebrity while ignoring countless other cases, it just screams political motivation.
And we know this because of the internal memos.
The internal memos confirm the real goal: silencing his highly visible, very high-profile anti-war activism. Our sources point to a really damning example, a memo from Senator Strom Thurmond.
One of the most powerful conservatives in the country.
He sent a memo directly to the White House, suggesting that using the INS for deportation was a necessary strategic countermeasure against Lennon's influence. It was bureaucratic warfare.
So Lennon fights this, he hires top lawyers, and he eventually wins in 1976. He gets his green card.
He does.
But this is where the CIA's involvement adds this whole other disturbing layer. Why would the Central Intelligence Agency be involved in a domestic immigration fight?
They shouldn't have been, period. The CIA's charter explicitly prohibits domestic operations inside the United States.
But they were.
They were. Documents that came out decades later under the Freedom of Information Act confirmed the CIA participated in the campaign to neutralize Lennon's activities.
Through a program called Project CAS.
Project CAS, which was designed to investigate international connections to American dissident movements. It was their way in.
So they were essentially laundering a domestic surveillance operation through an external intelligence agency.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And what's truly telling about how the CIA viewed him is the language they used. Our sources note that the files used cryptonyms code words when referring to the surveillance of Lennon.
And that's not normal.
It's extremely unusual and very significant. Cryptonyms are usually reserved for concealing the identity of foreign operations, high-level assets, or our foreign intelligence targets.
So they were treating him like a spy.
Administratively, yes. The government was treating Lennon not as a celebrity, not as a legal problem, but with the same level of institutional concern they'd reserve for a foreign threat. They were, in effect, defining him as an enemy of the state.
Which brings us right back to the 1980 threat assessment. If he has his green card, why now? Why is he a threat again? This is where the sleeping giant theory comes in.
The theory posits that the intelligence community watched Lennon's global reemergence and just freaked out. They feared the instant reactivation of the anti-war movement.
Right as the U.S. is gearing up for these proxy wars in Central America.
Operations that require secrecy and public compliance. Lennon's massive microphone was seen as a weapon of mass communication aimed directly at undermining that war effort.
And there was a ticking clock.
A huge ticking clock. Lennon was on the verge of obtaining full U.S. citizenship.
Which would have changed everything.
Completely. If he had become a citizen, his political speech would be absolutely protected by the First Amendment. You could never deport him again. Any future attempts to legally harass him would have hit a constitutional brick wall.
He would have become this untouchable, politically active figure of immense global power operating from inside the U.S.
A loose cannon, as the sources put it, that the incoming hardline Reagan administration and its intelligence agencies just could not afford to risk. The window to neutralize him was closing, and it was closing fast.
So Dossier A establishes this deep, decade-long institutional motive for wanting to silence Lennon. Now we have to pivot, because to execute a motive, you need a tool. Let's look at the life of Mark David Chapman, a life of just profound contradictions.
The official story paints him as the ultimate pathetic loner. He was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1955, and his documented psychological profile definitely confirms a deep well of trauma, of instability.
More than enough for a lone destructive act.
Oh, absolutely. The trauma started in childhood. It was centered around his abusive father, a U.S. Air Force staff sergeant, who was cruel to Chapman's mother. And this created this profound sense of helplessness and fear in him.
And to cope with that reality he couldn't control, he retreated into this really chilling fantasy world.
He claimed for years to be the king of a civilization of little people who lived in his bedroom walls.
Which is strange enough.
But the disturbing part wasn't just that they existed in his mind. It was the absolute control he had over them. He alone decided who lived and who died.
So this desire for total, unassailable control over a miniature world, psychiatrists see that as a deeply unstable precursor to his eventual decision to assume absolute control over the life of John Lennon.
Exactly. For a time, though, rigid structure seemed to help him. In his mid-teens, he becomes a fervent born-again Christian. He works as a YMCA counselor. He was actually quite good at it, resettling Vietnamese refugees.
He had this role, the protector of children.
Which is the profound irony that links back to The Catcher in the Rye later. But after a period of stability, that structure just collapses. And this brings us to the missing years and the financial anomalies.
Yeah.
And this is the critical pivot point for the hitman theory.
Because the narrative of the pathetic minimum wage loner completely breaks down when you look at his money and his movements in the late 70s.
It shatters.
We're talking about a guy who worked low-wage security jobs, like $4 an hour? Or was just unemployed, and yet he suddenly has the money for major international travel.
In 1978, while he's supposedly broke, Chapman goes on an exhaustive 6-week high-end trip around the world.
And we have the itinerary. It's meticulous.
Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bangkok, Delhi, Beirut, Geneva, London, Paris, and Dublin.
This is not backpacking with the Eurail Pass. That route, flights, customs, visas, hotels, and major global cities, that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars adjusted for inflation.
Far, far beyond the means of a security guard.
So what's the official explanation?
The official legal explanation tried to minimize it. They cited some help from his parents, a small credit union loan. But the sheer expense for that length of time and complexity just doesn't add up.
Theorists argue that level of liquidity points directly to an intelligence recruitment budget.
Facilitating controlled movement, potential training. The travel was just too extensive, too complex, and way too expensive for his verifiable income.
And within that itinerary, one stop just, it screams out. Beirut, Lebanon in 1978.
Precisely. Beirut in 1978 was not a tourist destination.
Not at all.
It was engulfed in a brutal, multi-factional civil war. It was globally notorious as a hub for espionage, for international militias, for clandestine training operations, for handovers. It was pure chaos. And people only went there with a very specific, usually very dark purpose.
So why would a young, born-again Christian from Georgia who should be, saving up for an apartment choose to voluntarily spend time in a war zone?
Theorists argue it wasn't wanderlust. It was potentially a deep cover or training ground, or a prearranged intelligence asset handover point.
And the financial weirdness didn't stop there.
It continued right up until the murder. While working his minimum wage job in Hawaii, Chapman somehow buys a Norman Rockwell lithograph, the famous triple self-portrait.
For how much?
For a staggering $7,500. A single piece of art that cost more than his entire annual income.
And the purpose of buying that artwork becomes chillingly clear in October of 1980.
He liquidates it. He sells the Rockwell to generate the exact liquid cash he needs to finance his trip to New York.
So that cash pays for his flight?
His flight, his stays at high-end hotels like the Waldorf Astoria and the Sheraton, and the purchase of the murder weapon.
There's a quote in our sources that just captures the perversity of it all.
One icon of innocence, the Rockwell painting, was used to fund the assassination of another John Lennon.
The duality is just so stark. You have this fragile, disturbed psychological profile,
Paired with a financial and travel history that suggests structure, purpose, and significant external funding.
and that funding and movement led him right to his psychological trigger, the obsession with a very specific book.
The psychological engine driving Chapman in those final months was J.D. Salinger's novel, The Catcher in the Rye.
And this book is the crucial bridge, isn't it? It's the foundation for his breakdown in the fan theory.
But it's also the central programming mechanism in the hitman theory. It works for both narratives.
Chapman didn't just relate to Holden Caulfield. He genuinely believed he was becoming him.
He was transforming into him. His obsession was eliminating phonies, adults he saw as hypocritical, inauthentic, corrupt, and he projected all of that hatred onto John Lennon.
He couldn't reconcile the idealism of imagine no possessions.
With the reality of the man singing it, a millionaire living in the super-exclusive protected Dakota building. Chapman saw Lennon's life as the ultimate lie, justifying what he had to do.
And he internalized this literary identity so completely that on the morning of the murder, he goes out, he buys a fresh copy of the book.
And inscribes a specific message inside. This is my statement.
He wasn't committing a random crime. He was performing a deliberate literary act of purification as the self-appointed catcher in the rye.
And conspiracy theorists seize on this specific obsession for a couple of reasons. First, the documented recurrence of the catcher in the rye and several other high-profile, politically motivated shootings from around that time is just statistically improbable.
It's just weird. It raises the whole Manchurian candidate link, the trigger object theory.
Which is the idea that in certain programming scenarios, like those rumored to be part of 𝐏𝐻𝐃, a specific object or a text can act as a post-hypnotic anchor, a final command.
So the book reinforces the programmed objective, eliminate the phony.
Exactly. And Chapman's behavior immediately after the shooting is the key piece of supporting evidence for this. He didn't run, he didn't panic, he didn't yell a slogan.
He showed an eerie calm.
An eerie calm. He took off his coat, he folded it neatly, and he started reading The Catcher in the Rye right there on the sidewalk.
Theorists interpret that not as insanity, but as the deactivation mode of a programmed assassin. Mission complete. Awaiting retrieval.
But the link to institutional power gets terrifyingly specific when we move past the psychology and look at the actual people at the crime scene.
We have to talk about the man standing right next to him. The Dakota doorman, Jose Sangenis Perdomo.
Perdomo is not just a coincidence. He is the ultimate statistical anomaly.
He was not a typical New York doorman.
Not even close. Our sources confirm he was a Cuban anti-Castro exile with a deep, documented, and dangerous history in U.S.-backed covert operations.
Specifically, he was a confirmed veteran of the failed 1961 CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion.
And it goes deeper. Research connects Perdomo directly to something called Operation 40, a shadowy, CIA-sponsored counterintelligence group.
And Operation 40 was?
Operation 40 was notorious. It was created specifically for sabotage, espionage, and political assassinations in the region to support U.S. foreign policy.
When you consider the history of that group, which allegedly played a role in multiple high-profile political killings, the presence of an Operation 40 veteran standing guard at the Dakota, where a documented target of the CIA lived,
It ceases to be random.
so the interaction between Chapman and Perdomo on December 8th becomes critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Chapman spent hours outside the Dakota, pacing, reading.
Hmm?
The sources confirm he spoke extensively and amicably with Perdomo during that 5-hour vigil. Chapman even later called him a nice guy.
So the theory is chilling. Was Perdomo acting as a handler, placed strategically at the residence of a high-value target to make sure the asset, Chapman, stayed in position and completed the mission?
His CIA-linked past is used as direct evidence that the agency had eyes on Lennon and the assassin in those final critical hours.
And when the shots were fired, Perdomo's reaction was professional.
Very. He immediately shouted, "Do you know what you've done?" before securing the scene, kicking the gun away, confirming the killer's identity to the police. The whole sequence suggests a trained mind taking charge.
Okay, let's reconstruct those final hours now, looking at the timeline and the tactics Chapman used.
The morning preparation alone suggests a level of conscious planning that goes way beyond a spontaneous psychotic break.
When he leaves the Sheraton Hotel, he deliberately arranges his passport and his Bible on the dresser for the police to find.
That's a huge tell. It signals he did not expect to return. He's planning for an endpoint, whether that's death or immediate arrest. Then he buys and inscribes the book.
And his interactions that afternoon, they reinforce this dual nature of his delusion and his planning.
Right. He talks to Paul Gurish, the amateur photographer, and tells him darkly, "You never know who you can trust these days."
And then there's the encounter with Sean Lennon.
He sees Sean and the nanny arrive, and Chapman reportedly shakes the 5-year-old's hand. He calls him a beautiful boy. It reinforces his Holden Caulfield reverence for children versus his mission to eliminate the corrupted adult phony.
Then at 5:00 p.m., we get that famous moment. Lennon and Ono are leaving for the studio. Chapman holds out the double fantasy album.
Lennon signs it. He dates it 1980. Gorish snaps the iconic photo, capturing the victim and killer together for history. And Lennon asks him, "Is that all you want?"
It's like he sensed something was off.
He definitely sensed the odd, desperate energy. And what follows is the vigil, a period of 5.5 hours, from 5:30 until 10:50 p.m.
Chapman paces, reads his book, and critically, he talks with Jose Perdomo. He's locked in place, just waiting.
And that long wait, his ability to stay calm, it really contrasts with the image of a mind that's just rapidly breaking down.
And then the critical moment of vulnerability. 10:50 p.m., the Lennon limousine returns. Instead of following the established standard protocol,
which is driving into the secured Dakota courtyard.
a protocol designed specifically to protect residents from exactly this kind of ambush.
The car inexplicably stops at the curb on 72nd Street.
This breach of protocol is often cited by hitman theorists as the single most fatal detail.
Was it just negligence by the driver? Or was there an external calculated pressure, maybe a suggestion from Perdomo or someone else, to make sure the target would get out in the less protected public space, exactly where the assassin was waiting?
It changed a highly secured entry into just a routine street encounter. And 2 minutes later, 10:52 p.m., the assassination is over. Lennon and Ono get out of the limo. As John passes Chapman, the attack is swift. It's decisive.
The weapon was a Charter Arms Undercover .38 Special, bought in Honolulu for what, like $170?
Yeah, a cheap, easily concealable weapon. But the ammunition choice, that elevates the whole discussion.
He used hollow point bullets.
He used hollow point bullets. And this is so important. Hollow points are designed to expand violently on impact, creating maximum tissue damage, massive internal bleeding, and ensuring immediate lethality.
That's specialized ammunition, not something an amateur just picks up.
It indicates a clear, professional intent to kill the target definitively and efficiently.
And the tactics support this. The NYPD Chief of Detectives, James Sullivan, reported that Chapman dropped into a specific combat stance when he fired.
A combat stance. For anyone who knows, that implies a crouched, stable position, probably a two-handed grip, designed for maximum stability, speed, and accuracy under pressure.
4 of those 5 shots hit Lennon in the back and shoulder, caused massive, immediate internal damage.
So this disciplined stance, the rapid fire, the choice of hollow point ammunition, it all collectively suggests a level of training that goes way beyond a minimum wage security guard job.
Theorists connect it directly back to that suspected training during the 1978 world trip. Maybe Beirut.
It's a strong connection.
Lennon collapses after gasping, "I'm shot!" And within minutes, the police are there. They find Chapman standing calmly, reading his book.
And that immediate execution of the crime, followed by that subsequent calm. Those are the two sides of the behavioral evidence that had to be analyzed in the legal and psychiatric aftermath.
Which is where things get even more contentious.
Yes. The way the authorities handled Chapman after the arrest and the legal maneuvers that followed are what effectively locked the official fan theory into place. It preempted any public examination of the evidence we've just been talking about.
In custody, Chapman was cooperative, but deeply bizarre.
He made those famous statements, "I'm sure the big part of me is Holden Caulfield. The small part of me must be the devil." I mean, that's clearly the language of someone with severe delusions.
And crucially, he talked about the moment of the shooting. He said he hesitated as the limo pulled up.
He did. He claimed that in that moment of hesitation, he heard a distinct voice. And he was careful to say it was not his own internal thought commanding him. Do it, do it.
And this alleged command is the absolute core of the psychiatric debate that dominated the initial proceedings.
For the defense psychiatrists, this was a textbook command hallucination, a classic symptom of paranoid schizophrenia. It suggested he was legally insane and couldn't form criminal intent.
So the legal battle became this true battle of the minds.
It really did. The defense team, led by Jonathan Marks, hired 6 independent psychiatric experts. All 6 unanimously concluded Chapman was psychotic.
6 out of 6.
5 diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, 1 with manic depression. They argued his delusions made him legally unable to distinguish right from wrong. They presented this detailed case that his fantasy life had just completely merged with reality.
So the act wasn't about fame. It was about this delusional necessity to eliminate a phony.
Right. And a psychotic individual can't control impulses they genuinely believe are commands from a higher power.
But the prosecution hired their own expert.
They hire the renowned forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Park Dietz. He conducted days of intensive interviews with Chapman, and his conclusion directly contradicted the defense. He said Chapman was not psychotic.
Dietz argued that Chapman suffered from severe personality disorders, narcissistic, borderline, but that he was fundamentally sane.
He concluded that the stories about the little people were a childhood fantasy that Chapman consciously chose to indulge in, not a true delusion he couldn't control.
And Dietz's interpretation was damning.
It was. He argued Chapman killed purely for glory and fame, and that he fully understood the moral and legal evil of his act. He just chose to do it anyway because the lure of celebrity through infamy was greater than his moral compass.
So the battle lines were drawn. Was he mad or was he calculating?
And this was all set to lead to a massive public trial, the trial of the century, really, a trial that would have publicly examined every single detail of Chapman's life.
His unexplained money, his global travels, his potential contacts in Beirut.
And most critically, his hours-long interaction with the CIA-linked doorman, Jose Perdomo.
But that public airing of the evidence never happened.
Never happened. Just as the trial was about to start, Chapman abruptly fired his lawyers and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder.
And his reason.
He said God told him to do it.
And that maneuver was the crucial legal move that permanently closed the door on the hitman theory in the court of law.
Because he pleaded guilty, there was no trial. There was no required legal discovery. The anomalies, the money, the Beirut stop, the Operation 40 connection, the CIA files, none of it was ever formally litigated, cross-examined, or entered into the public record.
The legal system just accepted the simple, easy narrative. A lone gunman confessing to a crime of fame.
On August 24th, 1981, he was sentenced to 20 years to life. And at his sentencing, he stood up and, in a final act of literary delusion, he read a long passage from The Catcher in the Rye. The act was sealed, but the evidence was never tested.
And decades later, Chapman is still in prison. He's been denied parole 12 times now.
That's right.
What's interesting is that in his recent parole hearings, he seems to be consciously solidifying that fan theory narrative, almost like he's trying to improve his chances for release by presenting a coherent, remorseful motive.
His recent statements are very explicit. He said, "I knew what I was doing, and I knew it was evil, but I wanted the fame so much that I was willing to give everything and take a human life." He stressed profound remorse for his selfish disregard. His public narrative now is all about personal pathological narcissism.
But the hitman counter-narrative persists, and it persists precisely because the legal record is so frustratingly incomplete.
Despite the confession, the court never had to officially reconcile the key financial and personnel anomalies we've discussed, and that creates this irreducible tension for anyone looking at the case today.
So let's just walk through that final synthesis for you, the listener. Let's juxtapose these points side by side to really see why this debate just won't die.
Okay, we start with motive, the official fan theory. Pathological narcissism, the desire to steal Lennon's fame, driven by the delusion of being Holden Caulfield.
The hitman theory counters with political neutralization, silencing a sleeping giant threat just before his citizenship would have made him untouchable.
Then, the do-it voice. Was it an auditory hallucination? A classic symptom of a collapsing schizophrenic mind?
Or was it a post-hypnotic trigger command implanted to make a programmed subject overcome a natural hesitation to kill?
Now, the figure of Jose Perdomo.
Yeah.
Was he just a doorman who happened to have this extraordinary yet coincidental past with the CIA and Operation 40?
Or was he a direct intelligence asset, a handler strategically placed at the Dakota to secure the target area and make sure the assassin stayed put?
The 1978 world trip, funded innocently by family or loans, just a young man's aimless wanderlust.
Or a covert agency-funded training and programming trip, with that bizarre Beirut stop serving as a training site which would explain the immense unexplained money.
Then, Chapman's behavior at the scene. Was his eerie calm, the folding of his coat, the reading of the book? Was that just pure insanity, deep dissociation?
Or was it the textbook deactivation mode of a programmed assassin who had completed his task and was just passively awaiting control?
And finally, the weapon and tactics. Was the .38 special just a cheap, available gun chosen by a disturbed amateur?
Or did the specific use of hollow-point bullets and their reported combat stance indicate a professional, premeditated intent to ensure death, suggesting a level of training he shouldn't have had?
You see the two great tragedies here. On one side, the tragedy of modern celebrity. A disturbed individual destroys an idol for personal validation.
And on the other, the tragedy of the deep state. The machinery of power using damaged individuals as disposable weapons to crush dissent.
And the core truth, I think, probably lies right in the friction where those two tragedies intersect.
Yeah.
Mark David Chapman was undeniably mentally ill. The evidence for that is robust.
Yeah.
The final critical question that remains is whether that illness was a naturally occurring, self-generated tragedy that led him to that sidewalk.
Or if it was a pre-existing weaponized vulnerability actively exploited by people who had already spent a decade watching John Lennon from the shadow.
The case is legally closed. That guilty plea made sure of that. The court never had to answer the tough questions.
But the files remain open, and the evidence is profoundly unsettling. The documented record confirms that even if Mark David Chapman truly acted alone in that final moment, the U.S. government had already spent a decade institutionally defining John Lennon as a political target who needed to be silenced.
And that reality, regardless of the shooter's motive, is why this debate about power and dissent persists. It forces you to consider what other truths might remain buried in the vast, unexamined history of state surveillance.